In the small farming town of Millbrook Valley, Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old struggling widow, has been desperately trying to save her late husband's 200-acre farm from foreclosure. With mounting debts and failed harvests, she's grown bitter and skeptical of anyone offering help. When her quiet neighbor David Chen, a 38-year-old immigrant farmer, suggests modern sustainable farming techniques for her failing fields, Sarah laughs him off, saying, "My fields don't need giants," referring both to his tall frame and his big ideas. But David has a secret. He's a former agricultural scientist who left his corporate job after a personal tragedy. As Sarah's situation becomes desperate and the bank threatens foreclosure, David quietly begins implementing revolutionary farming methods on his small adjacent plot. When his extraordinary harvest not only saves his own farm but generates enough profit to pay off Sarah's debts, both their lives are forever changed in the most unexpected way. This is a story about pride, loss, healing, and the extraordinary power of quiet kindness to transform lives. The morning sun cast long shadows across the withered cornfield as Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug trembling in her hands. The steam rose from the black liquid, like the last hopes escaping her chest. Outside, the brown stalks that should have been green and thriving in July stood like a monument to her failures. "Mrs. Mitchell?" The voice came from behind her, soft and accented. She didn't need to turn around to know it was David Chen, her neighbor from the small farm next door. He'd been coming by every morning for 2 weeks now, ever since the bank notice had been posted on her door. Sarah took a deep breath and turned around. David stood in her doorway, his tall 6'3" frame filling the space, holding a manila folder in his weathered hands. At 38, he had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and calluses that spoke of real work, but Sarah had grown tired of his persistent offers of help. "I told you yesterday, Mr. Chen, I don't need your advice." Her voice was sharper than she intended, but the weight of 3 years of struggle since her husband Tom's death had worn her patience thin. David stepped into the kitchen, uninvited but not unwelcome. He'd done this before. "Please, just David. And I brought something that might—" "Let me guess," Sarah interrupted, setting her mug down with more force than necessary. "More of your fancy farming techniques. Your sustainable this and organic that." She gestured toward her window, toward the failing crops that represented her last chance. "Look at my fields, David. Look at them. I've been farming this land for 15 years with my husband, and 3 years alone. You think I don't know what I'm doing?" David's expression remained patient, but Sarah caught a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, understanding, maybe even recognition of pain. "Sarah, I know you're a good farmer, but sometimes what?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the bitter laugh of a woman who'd heard too many promises, too many solutions that led nowhere. "You're going to save my farm with your big ideas? My fields don't need giants, David. They need rain. They need better soil. They need a miracle I can't afford." The word giants hung in the air between them. She'd chosen it deliberately, partly because of his imposing height, but mostly because of the way he carried himself, like a man who believed he could solve problems that had broken stronger people than her. David was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the folder in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more personal than she'd heard before. "I had a wife once, Li Mei. She used to say that pride was the only crop that grew well in bad soil." Sarah felt something twist in her chest. In 3 years of neighborly interactions, David had never mentioned a wife. The past tense wasn't lost on her. "She was a botanist," he continued, stepping closer to the window to look out at Sarah's struggling crops. "Before we came here, before I lost her, we worked together at Agri-Tech Solutions, corporate agriculture, designing systems for maximum yield." "Corporate." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "You were one of those suit and tie types who never got dirt under their fingernails." David smiled sadly and held up his hands, showing calluses and soil-stained lines. "These hands have been in soil every day for 5 years now, Sarah. Ever since Lee May died in that car accident. Ever since I realized that all my degrees and corporate solutions couldn't save the one thing that mattered most. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the old clock on the wall. Sarah found herself looking at David differently, seeing not the persistent neighbor with big ideas, but a man carrying his own weight of loss. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know. You couldn't have known. I don't talk about it much." David opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in charts, graphs, and what looked like soil analysis reports. "But Sarah, I need you to understand something. I'm not offering to help because I think you're failing. I'm offering because I know what it's like to watch everything important slip away while you're powerless to stop it." Sarah's hand went instinctively to the gold wedding band she still wore on her left hand. Tom had been gone 3 years, but the grief felt fresh every morning when she woke up alone, every evening when she ate dinner in silence, every time she looked at their fields and remembered his dreams for expanding their organic vegetable operation. "What's in the folder?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David spread the papers on her kitchen table. Soil composition analysis of both our properties, rainfall data for the past 5 years, crop rotation schedules that could restore nitrogen levels naturally. He pointed to a chart that showed her property outlined in red. "Sarah, your soil isn't dying because you're a bad farmer. It's dying because it's exhausted. You've been fighting the wrong battle." She leaned over the papers, trying to make sense of the scientific data. "I can't read this." Tom was the one who understood the technical stuff. I just tried to keep doing what we always did." "That's exactly the problem," David said gently. "What you always did was perfect for smaller scale operations with Tom helping, but alone trying to manage 200 acres with traditional methods and no help. Sarah, you're not failing. You're drowning." The word hit her like a physical blow. Drowning. Yes, that was exactly how it felt. Like she was going under, unable to breathe, fighting against currents too strong for her to handle alone. "So what are you suggesting?" she asked, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs. "That I learned to be a scientist overnight. That I completely change everything Tom and I built together." David sat across from her, his large hands folding the papers with surprising gentleness. "I'm suggesting that you let me help, not because you need a giant to save you, but because sometimes the best way to honor what we've built with the people we love is to let it grow into something even better." Sarah looked out the window again, at the brown corn that should have been green, at the vegetable plots that had produced barely enough to cover seed costs, at the debt notices that came with every mail delivery. The bank had given her until September 15th, less than 2 months, to bring her account current or face foreclosure. "I owe them $127,000, she said quietly. "Even if your fancy techniques worked perfectly, even if I had the best harvest of my life, I couldn't make that much in one season." David was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made her look at him sharply. "What if I told you that my 5 acres produced $180,000 in net profit last year?" Sarah stared at him. 5 acres. 5 acres. That's impossible. I'm working 200 acres, and I barely break even. It's not impossible. It's just different." David stood up, walking back to the window. "Sarah, I know you think I'm some dreamer with big ideas that don't work in the real world. But what if I could prove it to you? How? Let me work your fields this season. All of them. Use my methods, my equipment, my seeds." He turned back to her, and she saw something in his expression that looked almost vulnerable. "If I can't produce enough profit to pay your debts, I'll cover the difference myself." Sarah felt her heart stop. "David, you can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. You could lose everything. Your farm, your savings, everything." She stood up, facing him across the small kitchen. "Why would you risk that for someone who's done nothing but laugh at you and push you away?" David was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was so soft, She almost didn't hear him, because Li Mei would have done the same thing. Because helping you honor Tom's memory, maybe it helps me honor hers too. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time in months. Not tears of frustration or despair, but something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. What if you're wrong, she whispered. What if your methods don't work? What if we both lose everything? David met her eyes, and she saw something there that made her chest tight. Not the confidence of a man with all the answers, but the quiet determination of someone who had already lost everything once and survived. Then at least we'll have tried something beautiful together. Outside the window, a single green shoot was visible among the brown corn stalks. A volunteer plant that had somehow found the strength to grow despite the harsh conditions. Sarah hadn't noticed it before. I need time to think, she said. Of course. David gathered his papers. But Sarah, September 15th isn't that far away. After he left, Sarah stood in her kitchen for a long time, looking out at that single green shoot and thinking about giants, about pride, about the difference between giving up and letting go. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to wonder, what if 3 days passed before Sarah knocked on David's door. 3 days of sleepless nights, of walking through her dying fields at dawn, of staring at bank notices until the numbers blurred together. 3 days of remembering Tom's voice saying, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help, Sarah. David answered on the first knock, as if he'd been waiting. He was covered in soil, his hands dirty from morning work, but his eyes were alert and kind behind his glasses. I've been thinking about what you said, Sarah began, then stopped. The words felt too big for her throat. Come in, David said gently. I was just making tea. His kitchen was smaller than hers, but meticulously organized. The charts covered one wall, weather patterns, planting schedules, harvest projections. Everything Tom used to keep in his head, David had mapped out with scientific precision. You really think you can make $127,000 from my land in 2 months? She asked, accepting the steaming mug he offered. David sat across from her, his long frame folding into the chair. Not just make it, Sarah. I think we can make more than that. This only works if we do it together. I have the knowledge, but you know this land. You know its moods, its seasons. Tom taught you things that can't be found in any textbook. Sarah's chest tightened at the mention of her husband. Tom would have loved your charts, she said softly. He was always sketching out plans, trying to figure out better ways to rotate crops, to manage water. Tell me about him, David said. It wasn't what she expected. Sarah looked down at her tea, watching the steam rise. He was everything I wasn't. Patient, optimistic. He saw potential where I saw problems. Her voice caught. He used to say that farming wasn't about fighting the land, it was about dancing with it. Sounds like a wise man. He was. And when he died, Sarah set her mug down with shaking hands. When he died, I felt like I had to become him, had to be the dreamer, the planner, the one with all the answers. But I'm not him, David. I'm just angry and scared, and so tired of failing. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Li Mei used to tell me that plants don't grow because we force them to. They grow because we create the right conditions and then get out of their way. Is that what you want to do? Get out of my way? No, David said firmly. I want to create the right conditions for you to succeed. There's a difference. Sarah looked at the charts on his wall, trying to make sense of the careful notations. Show me what you're thinking. Really show me. Not just soil samples and graphs. David stood up, moving to his wall of charts. Your 200 acres are currently planted in traditional row crops. Corn, soybeans, some wheat, same pattern for 15 years, right? That's what Tom's father did, what his grandfather did. And it worked for them, because they had different challenges. Smaller scale, more hands, soil that wasn't depleted yet. David pointed to a satellite image of her property. But look at this. Your north 40 acres get perfect morning sun and have natural drainage. Your southeast corner has that small creek running through it. You're treating all your land the same when each section has different gifts. Sarah moved closer, seeing her property through his eyes. What are you suggesting? Intensive market gardening in your prime spots. High-value crops that restaurants and farmers markets pay premium prices for. Heirloom tomatoes, organic herbs, specialty greens. He pulled out another chart. 1 acre of intensive vegetables can generate what 20 acres of corn makes. But the work is different, not harder. And there are systems. Sarah, drip irrigation, raised beds, companion planting that does half the pest control naturally. David's voice grew excited, the way Tom's used to when he talked about a new idea. Your creekland, perfect for watercress and specialty lettuces. That rocky section you've been fighting with, ideal for lavender and herbs. Sarah found herself leaning in, studying the plans. This would mean ripping up everything Tom and I planted. No, David said softly. It would mean helping it become what it was always meant to be. The words hit her unexpectedly hard. She turned away from the charts, walking to David's window that looked out over his 5 acres. Even from here she could see the difference. His plants were fuller, greener, more alive than anything on her property. I'm scared, she admitted. Of what? Of failing again, of losing the last piece of Tom I have left. She pressed her palm against the cool glass. Of trusting someone and having them leave. David's reflection appeared behind hers in the window. Sarah, I can't promise that my methods will work perfectly. I can't promise that we'll make every penny you need, but I can promise that I'm not going anywhere. She turned to face him. How can you promise that? People leave, David. People die. People change their minds. People run away, David finished. Like I did when Lee May died. I ran from everything we'd built together because staying hurt too much. His honesty cut through her defenses. What changed? Time, and realizing that running away from love doesn't make it hurt less. It just makes the love feel wasted. He moved closer, not invading her space but offering his presence. Tom's love for this land, your love for Tom. It's not wasted unless you let it die with him. Sarah felt tears she'd been holding back for 3 days. What if I can't do this? What if I'm not strong enough? Then we'll figure it out together. But Sarah, David's voice grew gentle. You've been strong enough to keep this place running alone for 3 years. You've been strong enough to say no to help even when you desperately needed it. You're stronger than you know. She looked out at his thriving fields again. If we do this, if I let you help me, what happens after? When the debt is paid and the crisis is over? What do you want to happen? The question caught her off guard. What did she want? For 3 years she'd focused only on survival, on not losing what she had left. She'd never let herself think about what might come after survival. I want to build something beautiful, she said quietly. Something that would make Tom proud, but belongs to me too. Then that's what we'll do. Sarah walked back to the table, looking at the soil analysis reports, the planting schedules, the harvest projections. The numbers were optimistic but detailed, backed by research and experience. This wasn't a fantasy, it was a plan. $127,000, she said. Minimum, David replied. If everything goes according to plan, we're looking at closer to $200,000. And if it doesn't go according to plan, David met her eyes steadily. Then I keep my promise. Your debt gets paid either way. Sarah picked up the pen David had left on the table. For a moment she held it without writing, thinking about trust and risk and the difference between giving up and letting go. I need 3 conditions, she said finally. Name them. First, we do this as partners, equal partners. I won't be the woman you saved. I'll be the woman who helped save herself. Agreed. Second, you teach me everything, every technique, every system, every decision. If this works, I want to understand why. Of course. Third, Sarah hesitated, then forced herself to continue. If you're going to risk everything for me, I need to know that you're doing it for the right reasons. Not because you feel guilty about your wife, not because you see me as some project to fix. I need to know that you believe in me, not just in your methods. David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. Sarah, I've watched you for 3 years. I've seen you work 16-hour days in blazing heat. I've seen you fix equipment most people would need a mechanic for. I've seen you refuse help when accepting it would have been easier because you wanted to earn your success. He leaned forward slightly. I'm not offering to help because I think you need saving. I'm offering because I know that with the right support, you could be extraordinary. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening after being locked for years. She looked down at the pen in her hand, then at the partnership agreement David had quietly placed beside her elbow. When do we start? She asked, and signed her name. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, but for the first time in months, Sarah found herself hoping for rain. The rain came that night, just as Sarah had hoped. She stood at her bedroom window at 2 a.m., watching water pour over her dying corn, and for the first time in years, she felt like the weather was on her side instead of against her. By dawn, David was at her door with coffee, work gloves, and a truck full of equipment she'd never seen before. "Ready to meet your land again?" he asked, handing her a steaming travel mug. They walked the property together as the sun rose, David stopping every few yards to examine soil, test drainage, observe how water moved across the landscape. Sarah found herself seeing her own farm through new eyes. "This section here," David said, kneeling in what had been her struggling soybean field. "Feel this soil." Sarah knelt beside him, running the damp earth through her fingers. "It's different. Softer than I remember. That's because it's been starving for organic matter. Tom probably composted, right? Every fall. We had a huge pile behind the barn." Sarah's voice caught slightly. "I stopped after he died. It seemed like too much work for just me. We'll start a new pile tomorrow. But first," David stood, brushing soil from his hands. "We need to wake this land up." What followed were the most intensive 2 weeks of Sarah's life. David arrived every morning at sunrise with detailed plans for each day's work. Together they began the massive transformation of her 200 acres. First came the soil testing, not just basic pH and nutrients, but deep core samples that revealed the history of her land. David showed her how to read the results, like a story where her grandfather had kept livestock, where flooding had deposited rich sediment, where years of the same crops had drained specific minerals. "Your northwest corner," David said, studying a soil report over lunch one day. "It's perfect for what I have in mind." He led her to a section she'd always considered marginal, too hilly for easy tractor work, too rocky for traditional crops. But as David began explaining his vision, Sarah began to see possibilities instead of problems. "Terraced herb gardens," he said, sketching quickly in a notebook. "Lavender on the slopes for drainage, basil and cilantro in the flatter spots. Rosemary, thyme, oregano. Restaurants pay premium prices for fresh local herbs. But the initial investment, I brought seedlings from my greenhouse." And Sarah, David's eyes lit up with excitement. "There's a chef in the city, Marcus Rivera, at harvest table. He's been buying my herbs for 2 years. When I told him about our partnership, he wants to contract for everything we can grow." Sarah stared at him. "You already have buyers lined up?" "Not just Marcus. There's a boutique grocery chain, 3 farm-to-table restaurants, and an organic foods distributor. I've been building these relationships for 5 years, but I never had enough land to scale up." He looked at her seriously. "Sarah, your acreage combined with my connections, we're not just going to save your farm, we're going to revolutionize it." The work was backbreaking. They ripped out rows of dying corn, working from dawn to dusk, with borrowed equipment. Sarah's muscles ached in ways they hadn't since her first years of farming, but it was a good ache, the pain of building something instead of watching something die. David worked alongside her every step of the way, but he also taught constantly. He showed her how to read plant stress signs she'd never noticed, how to calculate optimal spacing for maximum yield, how to create natural pest barriers using companion planting. "See how I'm planting these marigolds between the tomato rows," he said one afternoon, both of them covered in sweat and soil. "They release compounds that repel nematodes and aphids. Instead of fighting nature, we're working with it." Sarah paused in her own planting to watch him work. His movements were efficient, but gentle, treating each seedling like it mattered. "You really love this, don't you?" "I love the science of it," David admitted, "but more than that, I love the hope of it. Every seed is a promise that the future will be better than today." As the days passed, Sarah began to see changes, not just in her land, but in herself. The constant knot of anxiety in her chest began to ease. Her hands, which had grown soft from too much paperwork and not enough fieldwork, developed new callus. She started sleeping through the night for the first time in months. But it wasn't just the physical work that was changing her. It was David's presence, not intrusive, not overwhelming, just steady. He brought lunch to share when she forgot to eat. He explained complex agricultural concepts in ways that made sense. He listened when she talked about Tom, without trying to fix her grief or rush her healing. One evening, as they finished installing an irrigation system in what would become her herb garden, Sarah found herself laughing at something David said about his first disastrous attempt at growing tomatoes. It was a real laugh, not bitter or forced, and it caught her completely off guard. "I haven't done that in a while," she said quietly. "What?" Laughed, really laughed. She looked at the neat rows they'd planted, the irrigation lines that would carry water exactly where it was needed, the future taking shape around them. "Tom used to make me laugh every day. I thought maybe that part of me died with him." David was quiet for a moment, coiling the extra irrigation tubing. Limay had this theory that laughter was like wildflowers. You can't force it to grow, but if you create the right conditions, it comes back stronger than before. Was she right? I don't know yet, but I'm starting to hope so. That night, Sarah walked her property alone as she often did, but instead of seeing failure and debt, she saw potential. The herb terraces were beginning to take shape. The intensive vegetable plots showed the first hints of green. The new composting system was already generating rich, dark soil amendment. But more than the physical changes, Sarah could feel something shifting inside her. For 3 years, she'd been holding her breath, waiting for the next disaster, the next failure. Now, for the first time, she was looking forward instead of just holding on. Her phone rang as she stood in what would soon be a field of heirloom tomatoes. The caller ID made her stomach clench. First National Bank. "Mrs. Mitchell? This is Janet Stevens from the loan department. I wanted to follow up on the notice we sent regarding your account." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar wave of panic. "I'm working on it, Janet. I have a plan. Miss Mitchell, I'm calling because we've received several inquiries from local businesses wanting to contract with your farm for produce delivery. A chef called asking about herb availability, and a grocery buyer mentioned you're transitioning to specialty crops." Sarah's eyes snapped open. She hadn't authorized anyone to contact businesses on her behalf. What exactly did they say?" "Well, Mr. Chen listed you as a partner in his agricultural consulting business. He provided references and projected income figures that are quite impressive." Janet's voice warmed slightly. "Mrs. Mitchell, if these projections are accurate, you'll be in a much stronger position than we anticipated." After she hung up, Sarah stood in her dark field for a long time, processing what had just happened. David hadn't just offered to help her save her farm. He'd already begun rebuilding her reputation, her future, her place in the agricultural community. She walked to his house, seeing lights still on in his kitchen. Through the window she could see him at his computer, typing rapidly, surrounded by order forms and contracts. She knocked softly, and he looked up, with surprise. "The bank called," she said when he opened the door. David's face went carefully neutral. "And they said you've been telling people I'm your business partner, that you've provided income projections and references." She stepped closer, studying his expression. "David, you've been working to save my reputation before we even knew if the crops would grow." He looked down at his hand. "Business is built on relationships, Sarah. I didn't want you to have to start from nothing when this works. When this works. Not if, when," he said firmly. "I've never been more certain of anything." Sarah felt something warm and unfamiliar spreading through her chest. Not just gratitude, but something deeper. Trust, maybe. Or recognition. The understanding that this man wasn't just helping her save her farm, he was helping her save herself. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You don't need to thank me. We're partners." "No," Sarah said, meeting his eyes. "Thank you for believing in me before I believed in myself." That night, she fell asleep not to the sound of her own worried thoughts, but to the gentle patter of rain on healthy soil, nourishing seeds that would soon become something beautiful. 6 weeks into their partnership, Sarah discovered David's secret. She'd come to his house early that morning to discuss the harvest schedule, letting herself into his kitchen as had become their custom. But instead of finding him bent over charts and coffee, she found him sitting at his table, staring at an opened letter with tears streaming down his face. "David!" She stopped in the doorway, uncertain whether to retreat or approach. He looked up, hastily wiping his eyes, but didn't try to hide the letter. "I'm sorry, today would have been Lee May's birthday." Sarah's heart clenched. In 6 weeks of working together daily, David had mentioned his wife only in passing. She'd assumed his grief had faded into something manageable, the way her own grief over Tom was supposed to have by now. "I can come back later," she offered quietly. "No, please." David folded the letter carefully. "Actually, I'm glad you're here. There's something I need to tell you." Sarah sat across from him, noting the way his hands shook slightly as he smoothed the creased paper. "This letter is from Lee May's parents. They live in Taiwan." His voice was barely above a whisper. They want me to come home, to sell the farm and move back, start over there." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Are you going to go?" David was quiet for a long moment, looking out his kitchen window toward their thriving fields. In just 6 weeks, the transformation had been remarkable. The herb terraces are lush and green. The intensive vegetable plots were producing more than Sarah had ever imagined possible, and the heirloom tomatoes were already drawing interest from high-end restaurants 3 cities away. 3 months ago, "I would have said yes immediately," David said finally. "Lee May's parents are the only family I have left. They've been asking me to come home for 5 years, but 3 months ago, I was just surviving, working my land, selling my produce, going through the motions." He looked at Sarah directly. "I wasn't living. I wasn't building anything. I was just existing in the space between who I used to be and who I might become." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "And now I'm part of something bigger. We're not just growing crops, Sarah. We're creating a sustainable business that could support both our families for generations. We're proving that small-scale intensive farming can compete with industrial agriculture." His eyes grew bright with passion. "We're building something Lee May would be proud of." "But you miss her," Sarah said softly. It wasn't a question. Every day, David's voice broke slightly. "Some mornings I wake up and for just a moment I forget she's gone. I turn to tell her about a new growing technique I want to try, or a funny thing that happened with the chickens. And then I remember." Sarah reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact with him, and she was surprised by how natural it felt. "I know," she whispered. "With Tom it was his coffee cup. Every morning I'd automatically make 2 cups, and every morning I'd have to pour one out." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 people who understood the particular loneliness of loving someone who was no longer there. "Sarah," David said eventually, "if I stay, and I want to stay, I need you to understand that I'm not trying to replace what I had with Lima, and I hope you know I'm not trying to replace Tom either." "I know," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. "Good, because what we're building here, it's not about forgetting the past. It's about honoring it by creating something beautiful in the present." That afternoon they worked together in the herb gardens, harvesting the first major crop for delivery to Marcus Rivera's restaurant. The work was meditative, cutting, bundling, sorting, and Sarah found herself thinking about David's words. "Can I ask you something?" she said, pausing in her bundling of rosemary. "Always. When you decided to help me, was it really about the farming, or was it about having someone to save?" David stopped working, considering her question seriously. "At first, maybe a little of both. I won't lie to you, Sarah. Helping you gave me a sense of purpose I'd been missing. But now it's not about saving anyone. It's about building something together that neither of us could create alone." He held up a perfect bunch of basil, the leaves deep green and fragrant. "This isn't David's herbs or Sarah's land. This is what we made together." That evening, Marcus Rivera himself came to inspect their first major delivery. Sarah had been nervous about meeting the renowned chef, but Marcus turned out to be warm and enthusiastic, praising the quality of their herbs and immediately placing orders for the next month. "David told me about your transition," Marcus said to Sarah as they walked through the herb terrace. "This is remarkable work. The flavor profiles of these herbs are exceptional." "David deserves the credit for that," Sarah replied. "I'm still learning his techniques." "Perhaps," Marcus said, "but David tells me you know this land better than anyone, that you can predict weather patterns 3 days out just by watching your chickens, and that you've never lost a crop to unexpected frost because you read the signs other farmers miss." Sarah looked at David in surprise. She'd never realized he'd been paying attention to those small instincts she'd developed over 15 years of farming. "Those skills can't be taught," Marcus continued. "They come from love and attention and time. David may have brought the science, but you brought the wisdom." After Marcus left with his truck full of premium herbs, Sarah and David sat on her porch, sharing a beer and watching the sunset paint their fields gold. $2,800, David said quietly. "What? 2 days delivery? $2,800 for 6 weeks of herb production from 2 acres. He took a long drink of his beer. "Sarah, we're going to exceed our projections by at least 30%. The number was almost incomprehensible. In her best year with Tom, they'd made $2,800 in profit from 20 acres of traditional crops. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," Sarah admitted, "for the other shoe to drop. What if it doesn't? What if this is just success?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching fireflies begin to dance in the gathering dusk. "I don't know how to be successful without Tom. For 15 years, every good thing that happened, I shared with him. Every milestone, every achievement, every moment of joy, he was there. And now I don't know who to celebrate with." David set his beer down and turned to face her. "Sarah, can I tell you something Lima used to say?" She nodded. "She said that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes shape. The love you had for Tom, it's not gone. It's in every decision you make about this land, every moment you choose to keep building instead of giving up." He paused, his voice growing softer. "And maybe, just maybe, it's in your willingness to let someone new into your life, even if they can never replace what you lost." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "David, I'm not asking for anything, Sarah. I'm not expecting anything. I just want you to know that you don't have to celebrate alone anymore. You don't have to carry the weight of this place by yourself." The silence stretched between them, comfortable and charged at the same time. Sarah found herself really looking at David, not as the neighbor who'd offered to help, or the business partner who was saving her farm, but as a man who'd become essential to her daily happiness in ways she was only beginning to understand. "The letter from Lelarme's parents," she said eventually. "What are you going to tell them?" That I found something here worth staying for. He met her eyes directly. That I found someone who makes me want to build a future instead of just honoring the past. Sarah's breath caught. They were crossing into territory neither of them had named aloud, but both had felt growing between them with each shared sunrise, each moment of laughter, each evening spent planning their shared dreams. "David, you don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know where I stand." But Sarah realized she did want to say something. For the first time in 3 years, she wanted to be brave about her heart instead of just her business. "I'm scared," she said quietly. "Of what?" "Of betraying Tom's memory, of caring about someone new and losing them too. Of being happy when I spent so long believing I didn't deserve to be." David reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Sarah, loving someone new doesn't diminish what you had before. It honors it. Tom loved you enough to want you to be happy. Don't you think he'd want you to keep living, not just surviving?" As if summoned by their conversation, a gentle breeze rustled through their thriving crops, carrying the scent of herbs and possibility. Sarah looked at their joined hands and felt something she thought had died with Tom, the courage to hope for love again. "Stay," she said simply. "What?" "Stay. Don't go to Taiwan. Stay here with me and help me figure out what comes next." David's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." That night Sarah fell asleep holding his hand, listening to the sound of healthy crops growing in soil that had learned to trust again. August brought the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the fields and turned the soil to dust by noon each day. Sarah and David worked in shifts, early morning until 10, then again from 5 until dark, to avoid the blazing midday sun. Their success had been beyond anything Sarah had dared to imagine. The herb contracts alone were bringing in $4,000 per week. The heirloom tomatoes were fetching premium prices at 3 farmers markets, and the specialty lettuces were sold out before they could even set up their stand completely. But success, Sarah was learning, brought its own challenges. Mrs. Mitchell, the voice belonged to Robert Hawkins, her neighbor to the east. Sarah looked up from the tomato plants she was staking to see him standing at the edge of her field, his weathered face set in hard lines. "Morning, Robert." Sarah straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead. She'd known Robert for 20 years, had always considered him a friend, but his expression today was far from friendly. "Need to have a word with you." David appeared from behind the tomato trellises, having heard the tension in Robert's voice. Robert's expression darkened when he saw him. "Robert, what can I do for you?" Sarah asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. "It's what you've already done that's the problem." Robert gestured toward her thriving fields. "You and your partner here are disrupting the whole market." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "I don't understand." "Don't play dumb with me, Sarah. You're flooding the farmer's market with fancy vegetables, undercutting prices that the rest of us need to survive." Robert's voice grew heated. Tom Mitchell never would have done this to his neighbors. The mention of Tom hit Sarah like a slap. "Robert, we're not undercutting anyone. We're selling different products to different markets. Different markets that used to buy from all of us." Robert shot back. "Marcus Rivera used to buy produce from 5 different farms. Now he gets everything from you. The Organic Harvest store stopped buying from me entirely last week. Said they had a new exclusive supplier." Sarah looked at David, who remained calm but alert. She realized they'd been so focused on their own success that they hadn't considered how it might affect their neighbors. "Robert, I never meant." "Course you didn't mean to, but you're doing it anyway." Robert's eyes moved between Sarah and David, with obvious disapproval. "Folks are talking, Sarah, about how you've changed since Tom died, about the kind of man you're choosing to associate with." The words hung in the air like a threat. Sarah felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "What exactly are people saying?" David's voice was quiet, controlled, but Sarah could hear the steel underneath. Robert's jaw worked as if he were chewing something bitter. They're saying you've got ideas above your station now, that you're forgetting where you come from, who your people are. My people. Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. The farming community that supported you when Tom died, that gave you extensions on equipment loans, that helped with your harvest the first year you were alone. Robert looked directly at David, not outsiders who come in with fancy degrees and foreign ideas. The word foreign hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stepped forward, putting herself between Robert and David. David Chen is more of a farmer than most people in this county, she said firmly, and he's done more to help this community than anyone has in years. By running the rest of us out of business, by showing what's possible. Sarah's composure finally cracked. Robert, your corn yields haven't changed in 10 years. Your equipment is held together with duct tape and hope. Instead of being angry about our success, maybe you should ask yourself what you could do differently. Robert's face went red. There it is, the real Sarah Mitchell. Too good for the rest of us now that you've got your fancy partner and your premium prices. That's enough. David stepped forward, his tall frame imposing despite his calm demeanor. Miss Hawkins, if you have concerns about market competition, there are proper channels. Don't you tell me about proper channels, boy. Robert's voice dripped with contempt. This is our community, our way of life. You don't belong here. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. Not heartbreak, but the snapping of the last ties that bound her to who she used to be. Get off my land, she said quietly. Sarah, get off my land, Robert, and don't come back. After Robert left, Sarah and David stood in the blazing sun, the weight of the confrontation settling over them like dust. I'm sorry, David said finally. For what? For making things harder for you with your neighbors. For not thinking about how our success might affect others. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. His face was etched with concern, not for himself, but for her, for the community relationships he feared his presence had damaged. David, are you thinking about leaving? The question seemed to surprise him. What? No. Why would you? Because that's what people do when things get complicated. They leave. Sarah's voice was bitter with old pain. Tom left, not by choice, but he still left, and now my neighbors think I should choose between their approval and my future. David moved closer, his hands finding her shoulders. Sarah, look at me. She raised her eyes to his. I'm not leaving, not because of Robert Hawkins, not because of community pressure, not because things get difficult. His grip on her shoulders tightened slightly. But I need you to tell me the truth. Do you agree with him? Do you think I don't belong here? Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I think you're the best thing that's happened to this land in years. I think Tom would have loved you and your ideas. I think, she took a shaky breath. I think I'm falling in love with you, and that terrifies me because loving someone means risking everything. David's expression softened. Without words, he pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest while she finally let herself cry. Not the bitter tears of loss she'd shed for 3 years, but the overwhelming tears of someone who'd found hope again just in time to fear losing it. We'll figure this out, he murmured against her hair. The business, the community, all of it. But Sarah, you don't have to choose between honoring Tom's memory and building a future. You don't have to choose between belonging here and being successful. That afternoon brought the first real crisis of their partnership. A late summer storm system moved in faster than the weather service had predicted, bringing hail the size of golf balls and winds that flattened 3 rows of their prized tomatoes. Sarah and David worked frantically to cover what they could, but by the time the storm passed, the damage was extensive. Nearly half of their late summer crops were destroyed, including the specialty lettuces they'd promised to 3 restaurants for the following week. How much? Sarah asked, surveying the wreckage. David was doing calculations on his water-stained notepad. $23,000 in lost revenue. Maybe more if we can't fulfill the contracts. Sarah sank down onto an overturned crate, the weight of the day finally crushing her. The confrontation with Robert, the community pressure, and now this. For a moment she felt like the old Sarah again, defeated, overwhelmed, ready to give up. "Sarah," David's voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me." She raised her head. "This is a setback, not a failure. We still have the herbs, the early tomatoes, the root vegetables. We'll call Marcus and the other buyers, explain what happened, offer alternatives." He knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "One storm doesn't undo everything we've built. But the lost income, we'll make it up. Maybe not this month, but we will. Sarah, we've already proven that this works. One bad day doesn't change that." Sarah looked around at the storm damage, then at the man kneeling in the mud beside her, still believing in their future when everything seemed to be falling apart. "What if Robert's right?" she whispered. "What if I am forgetting who I am, where I come from? Then maybe," David said softly, "it's time to decide who you want to become instead." That night they worked until midnight by flashlight, salvaging what they could and making lists of what needed to be replanted. It was hard, dirty, exhausting work, but Sarah realized something as they labored together. She wasn't facing this crisis alone. For the first time in 3 years, when disaster struck, she had someone beside her who wouldn't leave, wouldn't give up, wouldn't let her face the storm by herself. "David," she said as they finally headed toward their houses, both exhausted and covered in mud. "Yeah, earlier when I said I was falling in love with you." He stopped walking, his full attention on her. "I lied," Sarah continued. "I'm not falling, I've already fallen, completely." David's smile was visible even in the darkness. "Good," he said simply, "because I fell for you the first day I saw you refuse to give up on land that everyone else said was hopeless." They kissed there in the muddy field, surrounded by the wreckage of the storm and the promise of tomorrow's rebuilding. Two people who'd found each other just in time to weather whatever came next together. September arrived with unseasonably perfect weather, warm days, cool nights, and just enough rain to keep everything green without threatening the harvest. Sarah woke each morning with a mixture of excitement and terror. In 2 weeks the bank's deadline would arrive, and they would learn if their gamble had paid off. The storm damage had been a blessing in disguise. Forced to replant quickly, David had introduced even more intensive growing methods. The replacement crops were coming in stronger and more productive than the original plantings. What had seemed like disaster was turning into abundance. "Look at this," David said, appearing at Sarah's kitchen door with an armload of vegetables that looked like they belonged in a magazine. "The butternut squash from the replanted section. Have you ever seen anything like this?" Sarah had to admit she hadn't. The squash were perfect, uniform size, unblemished skin, the deep golden color that commanded premium prices. Everything they were harvesting was like this. Better than good, approaching perfection. "Marcus wants to feature our vegetables in his fall harvest menu," David continued, setting the produce on her counter. "He's talking about a 5-course tasting dinner, each course built around our crops. The publicity alone would be worth thousands." Sarah picked up one of the perfect squash, hefting its weight. "Sometimes I can't believe this is real. 6 months ago, I was growing weeds and debt. Now we're supplying high-end restaurants. It's real," David said, moving closer. "And Sarah, we need to talk about what happens after September 15th. She knew this conversation was coming but had been avoiding it. September 15th was the bank deadline, but it was also the end of the growing season, the natural conclusion to their partnership agreement. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "I mean, we need to decide if this is just a one-season arrangement or if we're building something permanent." David's voice was careful, neutral. "The bank debt will be paid, but what then? Do I go back to my 5 acres? Do we dissolve the partnership?" Sarah felt her chest tighten. She'd been so focused on saving her farm that she hadn't let herself think about what came after saving it. About whether David would stay, whether their relationship was built on crisis or something deep. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've never been good at planning for success." That afternoon, she got a call that changed everything. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Jennifer Walsh from Midwest Agricultural Solutions. I understand you've been working with David Chen on intensive farming techniques. Sarah frowned. Yes, that's right. May I ask how you got my number? Mr. Chen is quite well known in agricultural circles. Mrs. Mitchell, we've been following his work with great interest. I'm calling because we'd like to offer you both a very substantial consulting contract. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. What kind of contract? We want to hire you and Mr. Chen to develop and demonstrate sustainable intensive farming techniques for small-scale operations. The contract would be worth $300,000 annually, plus bonuses based on the success of pilot programs. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. $300,000, more than she'd ever imagined making in 5 years, much less one. I need to discuss this with David, she managed. Of course, but Mrs. Mitchell, I should mention that this offer is contingent on both of you participating. Chan's scientific expertise combined with your practical experience and local knowledge, that's what makes this valuable to us. After Jennifer hung up, Sarah sat in her kitchen for a long time, staring at the perfect vegetables David had brought her. Everything was changing so fast. 6 months ago, she'd been a failing farmer facing foreclosure. Now she was apparently valuable enough for corporations to pursue. She found David in the herb gardens, preparing the final major harvest of basil before the first frost. We need to talk, she said. David looked up from his work, reading something in her expression. What's wrong? Sarah told him about the call from Midwest Agricultural Solutions. As she spoke, she watched his face carefully, trying to read his reaction. $300,000, he said quietly when she finished, plus bonuses. Sarah, this is life-changing money. For both of us. I know. But Sarah sank down beside him in the herb garden, breathing in the sharp scent of basil and rosemary. But I don't know if I want my life changed by someone else's agenda. This farm, what we've built here, it's ours. It's personal. It's about more than money. David was quiet for a moment, his hands continuing to work automatically. Are you asking what I think about the offer? I'm asking what you want, David. Not what makes financial sense, not what's practical. What do you want? He stopped working and looked at her directly. I want to wake up every morning and see you making coffee in your kitchen. I want to spend my days working beside you building something that matters. I want to go to sleep at night knowing that tomorrow we'll do it all again. Sarah felt her breath catch. That's not what the corporate job offers. No, it's not. David reached over and took her soil-stained hand in his. Sarah, the consulting contract would mean traveling constantly, working with different farms, implementing other people's visions. It would mean success and recognition and financial security. But it wouldn't be this. It wouldn't be us. He gestured toward their thriving fields. This isn't just about farming, Sarah. This is about home. This is about building a life together. That evening they walked their property together, tallying the final harvest numbers. The results were staggering. From 2,000 acres that had been producing less than $30,000 annually, they were looking at over $180,000 in profit for just one growing season. More than enough to pay the bank debt, David said, checking his calculator for the third time. More than enough for a lot of things, Sarah agreed. They stopped at the highest point on her property, where David had built a small bench earlier in the summer. From here they could see their entire operation. The herb terraces, the intensive vegetable plots, the perfectly organized greenhouse complex David had constructed. Sarah, David said, I need to tell you something. She turned to face him, noting the serious tone in his voice. When I first offered to help you, I had an ulterior motive. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What do you mean? I mean, I wasn't just being altruistic. I wasn't just trying to save your farm. David looked down at his hands. I was falling in love with you, and I was desperate to find a reason to be part of your life. Sarah stared at him. You, what? I'd been watching you for 2 years, Sarah. Watching you work alone in those fields, watching you refuse help from everyone, watching you fight so hard to save something you loved. His voice grew soft. I fell in love with your determination before I fell in love with your smile. I offered to help because I wanted to be close to you, and saving your farm seemed like the only way you'd let me. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. So this whole thing, our partnership, the success, everything, it was based on you having feelings for me. It was based on me believing in you when you didn't believe in yourself, David corrected. The feelings just made me brave enough to try. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening onto a room she'd never seen before. David, do you know what I was thinking the first day you offered to help me? That I was crazy? I was thinking that you were the first person since Tom died who looked at me and saw possibility instead of problems. She reached for his hand. I was thinking that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as broken as I thought I was. David squeezed her hand. You were never broken, Sarah. You were just buried under grief and debt and fear. All I did was help you dig your way out. As the sun set over their successful fields, Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives forever. I'm going to call Jennifer Walsh tomorrow, she said. David's face fell. You want to take the consulting job? I want to turn it down. Sarah smiled at his look of surprise. I want to tell her that we're not available for corporate consulting because we're too busy building something beautiful right here. Sarah, that's a lot of money to walk away from. It is. But David, money isn't what saved this farm. Love saved it. Your love for the land, my love for Tom's memory, and she took a deep breath. Our love for each other. David's smile was like sunrise. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything. Sarah stood up, pulling him with her. Come on. Let's go home and start planning next year's crops. As they walked back toward their houses, soon Sarah hoped to be their house. She felt something she hadn't experienced in years, complete certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, building exactly the right life. The harvest was more than abundant. The harvest was perfect. September 14th dawned clear and cold, with the first hint of frost sparkling on the grass. Sarah woke before her alarm, her stomach tight with anticipation. Tomorrow was the bank deadline, but today was the final harvest, the moment when months of work would be reduced to numbers on a balance sheet. David was already in her kitchen when she came downstairs, as had become his habit. But instead of his usual cheerful morning greeting, he looked troubled. What's wrong? Sarah asked, pouring coffee into the mug he'd set out for her. I couldn't sleep last night, so I went over the numbers again. David pushed a ledger across the table to her. Sarah, we have a problem. Her heart stopped. What kind of problem? The storm damage cost us more than I initially calculated. Between the lost crops, the replanting expenses, and the delayed deliveries that caused contract penalties, David rubbed his forehead tiredly. We're short. Sarah sank into her chair, staring at the neat columns of figures. How short? $18,000. The number hung in the air between them like a death sentence. So close. They had been so incredibly close. 18,000, Sarah repeated numbly. After everything we've accomplished, we're still going to lose the farm over $18,000. No. David's voice was firm. No, we're not. David, we don't have $18,000 lying around. The harvest is complete. The contracts are fulfilled. There's no more money coming in this season. Then we'll find another way. Sarah looked up at him, seeing the stubborn set of his jaw that she'd come to know well. What other way? We can't create money out of thin air. David was quiet for a moment, then stood up and walked to the window, overlooking their successful fields. I have savings from my corporate days, from Lime's life insurance. I can cover the 18,000. David, no. Sarah's response was immediate and sharp. This is my debt, my responsibility. It's our partnership, but it was my farm that was failing. My poor management that created the debt in the first place. Sarah stood up, joining him at the window. I won't let you pay for my mistakes. Sarah, Those aren't mistakes. Those are circumstances. Tom's death, 3 years of bad weather, rising costs, falling commodity prices, none of that was your fault. But accepting your money to fix it would be taking charity. And I've learned something about myself these past months. Dave, I'd rather lose with dignity than win with someone else's money. David turned to face her fully. Even if losing means losing everything we've built together. The question hit her like a physical blow. What do you mean? I mean, if the bank forecloses, you lose the land. And if you lose the land, David's voice grew quiet. Where does that leave us, Sarah? Where do I fit in your life if this place doesn't exist? Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She hadn't considered that losing the farm might mean losing David too. You'd leave. I'm not talking about leaving you. I'm talking about losing the foundation we built our relationship on. This farm isn't just your home, Sarah. It's become mine too. It's where we fell in love, where we built our future. His hands found her shoulders. I'm not trying to buy your farm for you. I'm trying to save our home. The distinction was important, Sarah realized, but it still felt wrong to let him sacrifice his financial security for her problems. There has to be another way, she said. That afternoon, Sarah did something she hadn't done in 20 years. She called her sister Patricia in Chicago. Sarah? Patricia's voice was surprised. Is everything okay? You never call. Patty, I need to ask you something, and I need you to listen before you say no. Okay, you're scaring me. What's going on? Sarah took a deep breath and explained everything. The farm's near failure, David's help, their incredible success, and now the final shortfall that threatened everything. So, let me understand this. Patricia said when Sarah finished. You and this David have turned your failing farm into a $180,000 a year operation in one season? Yes, and you're going to lose it all over $18,000, unless I can find the money somewhere. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, when Mom died, she left us both money. You used yours as a down payment on the farm with Tom. I invested mine. Sarah remembered. Their mother had left them each $50,000, a fortune to 2 young women in their 20s. I still have mine, Patricia continued. It's grown over the years. Sarah, I can loan you the $18,000. Patty, I can't. Yes, you can, because you're my sister, and because from what you've told me, this David sounds like the best thing that's happened to you since Tom. Patricia's voice grew warm. Besides, it's not charity. It's a loan. You'll pay me back from next year's profits. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Why would you do this for me? We barely talk. We haven't been close since you chose Tom and the farm over moving to Chicago with me. Since you chose a life I couldn't understand. Patricia's voice grew soft. Sarah, I've been waiting 20 years for you to need me again. I'm not going to let pride stand in the way now. That evening, Sarah met David in their usual spot on the bench, overlooking the fields. She'd called the bank, arranged for Patricia's wire transfer, and confirmed that the debt would be paid in full by the morning deadline. It's done, she said simply. David looked at her with surprise. Patricia agreed to help. She did more than agree. She said she'd been waiting 20 years for me to need her again. And how do you feel about accepting help from your sister? Sarah considered the question, different than I would have felt accepting it from you. Because she's family, because she's not risking her heart along with her money. Sarah turned to face David fully. David, when you offered to cover the shortfall, it wasn't just about the money, was it? No. It was about proving that you're committed to this, to us, to our future. Yes. Sarah reached for his hand. You don't need to prove that anymore. You've been proving it every day for months, by staying when things got difficult, by defending me to the neighbors, by choosing to build a life here instead of taking that corporate job. David squeezed her hand. So what happens now? Now we pay the bank. We keep our land. We start planning for next season. Sarah smiled. And we figure out what it means to be successful instead of just surviving. The next morning, September 15th, Sarah walked into First National Bank with a certified check for $127,000. Janet Stevens looked at the check with undisguised amazement. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is remarkable. 6 months ago, we were preparing foreclosure paperwork. Now you're paying off the entire loan ahead of schedule." "It's been quite a year," Sarah agreed. "I understand you're working with David Chen now. We're partners." Janet smiled. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. The bank would be very interested in discussing expansion loans if you're planning to grow the operation." Walking out of the bank as a debt-free landowner felt surreal. Sarah stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking back at the building that had haunted her dreams for 3 years, and felt something she'd almost forgotten: complete security. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. How did it go? She typed back. We're free. His response came immediately. "Come home. I have champagne. Home." Sarah smiled as she walked to her truck. Yes, it was definitely time to go home. That evening they celebrated with champagne on the porch, watching the first stars appear over their debt-free land. But Sarah found herself thinking not about what they'd saved, but about what they'd built. "David," she said, "I need to ask you something. Anything. This success, this partnership, this life we're building. Is it what you expected when you first offered to help me?" David was quiet for a moment, considering. "It's better than I expected." "How?" "Because I thought I was helping you save your farm. I didn't realize you were going to save me too." Sarah felt her chest fill with warmth. "Save you from what?" "From a life of just going through the motions, from existing instead of living." He turned to face her. "Sarah, before you, I was a man honoring his dead wife's memory. Because of you, I'm a man building a future worthy of her blessing." The words were so beautiful, so exactly right, that Rassi felt tears spill over. "I love you, David Chen. I love you too, Sarah Mitchell." As they sat together on the porch of her debt-free farm, surrounded by the evidence of their shared success, Sarah realized that they hadn't just saved her land. They had saved each other, and in doing so they had created something entirely new. A love built not on need or desperation, but on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the unshakable foundation of two people who had chosen each other freely, completely and forever. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the same spot where she'd first laughed at David's offer to help, but everything had changed. The kitchen window now looked out over 300 acres of thriving crops. They'd been able to purchase the adjacent Hawkins property when Robert decided to retire and move to Florida. The morning sun illuminated neat rows of vegetables, terraced herb gardens, and a new greenhouse complex that supplied restaurants across 3 states. But the most significant change wasn't in the land. It was in the woman standing at the window. "The reporter will be here in an hour," David said, appearing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that still made her heart skip after all these months. "I still can't believe they want to do a story about us," Sarah said, accepting her coffee and the gentle kiss he pressed to her temple. "Small farm, big dreams, how 2 neighbors revolutionized sustainable agriculture," David quoted the headline. "Pretty accurate, I think." Sarah laughed, but it was a different laugh than the bitter sound she'd made when she first dismissed David's help. This laugh was full of joy, of disbelief at how much life could change in such a short time. "My fields don't need giants," she said softly, remembering her exact words from that day. "What was that?" "That's what I said to you. When you first offered to help, I said my fields don't need giants." She looked at him, this tall, gentle man, who had indeed proven to be a giant, not in the way she'd feared, but in all the ways that mattered. "I is so wrong." David set down his coffee and moved closer. "Actually, you were right." Sarah looked at him in confusion. "Your fields didn't need giants, Sarah. They needed partners. They needed someone who believed in their potential, who was willing to work alongside them, who understood that growth happens when you create the right conditions and then trust in something bigger than yourself." Before Sarah could respond, a car pulled into their driveway. Through the window she saw Patricia getting out, followed by a man Sarah didn't recognize. "Patty's here," she said, moving toward the door. "With her mysterious +1," David added, with a grin. Sarah had reconciled with her sister over the past year, their relationship growing stronger through weekly phone calls and monthly visits. Patricia had never asked for repayment of the $18,000 loan. "Consider it my investment in your happiness," she'd said, and had become one of David and Sarah's biggest supporters. "Sarah," Patricia called out, hurrying across the yard with her arms open. "Look at this place. Every time I come here, it's more beautiful." Sarah hugged her sister tightly, still amazed by how naturally their relationship had healed once she'd allowed herself to be vulnerable enough to ask for help. "Patty, who's your friend?" Sarah asked, noticing the distinguished-looking man hanging back politely. Patricia's cheeks turned pink. "Sarah, David, I'd like you to meet Dr. James Morrison. Well, he's been helping me understand why my little sister is so happy living in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by vegetables." James stepped forward with an easy smile. "I'm a professor of sustainable agriculture at Northwestern. Patricia showed me the articles about your farm, and I've been following your work with great interest." "More than interest," Patricia said meaningfully. "James has been trying to convince the university to use your farm as a model for their sustainable agriculture program." Sarah felt David's hand find hers, squeezing gently. Even now, after all their success, recognition from the academic world felt surreal. "But more importantly," Patricia continued, her blush deepening, "James has been helping me understand something I never thought I'd understand." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "How someone can fall in love with land, with a way of life, with—" Patricia looked at James, then back at Sarah, "with a person who represents everything good about choosing roots over ambition." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. For 20 years, Patricia had seen Sarah's choice to farm as settling for less. To hear her sister finally understand that it had been choosing more was a gift Sarah hadn't known she needed. "There's something else," Patricia said, reaching into her purse. "Something I should have given you a long time ago." She pulled out a small wooden box that Sarah recognized immediately. It had belonged to their mother. "Mom left this for you specifically," Patricia said. "I was supposed to give it to you when you got married, but I was so angry about you choosing Tom and the farm over our sisterhood that I kept it. I'm sorry, Sarah. I was wrong to hold on to it." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside was their mother's engagement ring, a simple solitaire their father had saved for months to buy, and a folded letter in their mother's handwriting. "My darling Sarah," the letter began, "if Patricia is giving you this, it means you've found someone worth sharing your life with. I hope he loves the land the way you do. I hope he understands that your heart grows things, crops, dreams, love, and that tending to what matters most is the highest calling in the world. Wear this ring knowing that love, like farming, requires patience, faith, and the courage to plant seeds even when you can't see the harvest coming. Love, Mom." Sarah was crying before she finished reading. She looked at David, who was watching her with such tenderness, it made her chest ache. "Sarah," he said softly, taking the ring from the box. "I had a whole speech planned for later, but I think your mother already said everything I wanted to say." He hipped to one knee right there in her kitchen, with Patricia and James watching and tears streaming down Sarah's face. "Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life growing beautiful things alongside you?" "Yes," Sarah whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." As David slipped her mother's ring onto her finger, Sarah felt something she'd thought was lost forever, the sense that everything in her life was exactly as it was meant to be. The rest of the day passed in a blur of celebration. The reporter arrived and spent hours documenting their story, interviewing them about their methods, their success, their plans for the future. Sarah found herself talking about Tom naturally, lovingly, without the stabbing pain that had accompanied his memory for so long. "He would have loved all of this," she told the reporter. "Tom always said that farming was about hope, about obeying that tomorrow could be better than today. I think he'd be proud that I found my way back to hope." As evening approached, their friends began arriving for what had been planned as a simple harvest dinner, but had become an impromptu engagement party. Marcus Rivera came with his wife, bringing dishes made entirely from their produce. Janet Stevens from the bank arrived with a bottle of champagne and stories about how their success had inspired other struggling farmers to seek help. Even some of their neighbors came, not Robert Hawkins, who remained bitter about their success, but others who had begun to see them not as outsiders disrupting tradition, but as innovators showing the way forward. As the sun set over their thriving fields, Sarah found herself standing on the porch with David, watching their friends and family celebrate in the yard below. "Do you remember what you asked me that first day?" Sarah said, "about what would happen if your methods didn't work. I remember. You said then at least we would have tried something beautiful together." She turned to face him, this man who had saved her farm and her heart and her future. "David, we didn't just try something beautiful, we created it." David pulled her closer, and Sarah could smell the herbs from their gardens on his clothes, could see the satisfaction of honest work in his eyes. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Sarah looked out over their land, their successful, thriving, debt-free land, and felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of how much had changed. A year and a half ago, she'd been a bitter, failing farmer facing foreclosure. Now she was an engaged woman, standing on the porch of a profitable, sustainable farm, surrounded by people who loved her, planning a future with a man who saw her not as someone to be saved, but as someone to be celebrated. "I'm thinking about giants," she said finally. "What about them?" Sarah smiled, remembering her exact words from that first day. "My fields don't need giants." She'd been so wrong, but also in a way so right. "I'm thinking that maybe giants aren't about size or power or having all the answers," she said. "Maybe giants are just people who believe in possibilities when everyone else sees problems. People who are willing to risk everything for something they can't yet see but know in their hearts is possible." David was quiet for a moment, then said, "And maybe people who need giants aren't weak. Maybe they're just wise enough to recognize when something beautiful is being offered." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks again, but they were happy tears, tears of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, to this moment, to this man, to this life she'd never dared to dream was possible. "I love you, David Chen," she said. "I love you too, future Mrs. Chen," he replied. As they kissed on the porch of their successful farm, surrounded by the sound of friends celebrating and the scent of thriving crops, Sarah realized that the story that had begun with her laughing bitterly at the idea of help had become something she'd never expected. A love story, not just between her and David, but between her and the land, between her past and her future, between who she'd been and who she was becoming. Her fields had needed giants after all. They'd needed the giant heart of a man who believed in second chances, who understood that love could grow in the same soil where grief had taken root, who knew that the most beautiful harvests come not from fighting the land, but from learning to dance with it. And Sarah had needed to become a giant too, giant enough to accept help, to trust again, to believe that she deserved not just to survive, but to flourish. As the stars appeared over their thriving farm, Sarah Mitchell, soon to be Sarah Chen, stood in the arms of the man who had helped her save everything that mattered, and realized that sometimes the most perfect endings are really just beautiful beginnings. The harvest was complete, the debt was paid, the future was planted, and for the first time in years, Sarah knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. Another day of building something beautiful with the person she loved, on land that had taught them both that growth is always possible, even after the hardest winters. Her fields hadn't just found their giant. Her heart had found its home.